Most of you here know us, for which I'm going to apologize in advance. For those few of you who don't know us, the short version is, he's Bud Jermy, I'm Chip Jermy. We're local residents. My dad is a retired dean at Cornell. I'm an adjuster here at McNeil. We've always jokingly said that business is the family day job, history is the family non-day job. We're both former village historians up in Homer. We've worked with Glen Haven. We helped out here for nearly 13 years. And again, on that regard, and we actually did this presentation first time 11 years ago, so it's just sort of good to be back, and we appreciate Jamie asking us back. What we're going to give you today, I will warn you, Jermys have two speeds. We either don't talk enough or we talk too much. You can't put
Usually it's too much.
Yeah, with him occasionally it's like more. What we're going to give you today is, if you've ever come, or you come, and we hope you will, to our July 4th, a lot of this is the extra stuff. That's the way we presented this 11 years ago. That's what we're going to do today. Jamie has given us a time limit, which is good for us and it's good for you. We have, and in case you think, have I heard some of this before? We were literally adding things this morning, so you haven't because we haven't. If you have any questions, we'd ask you to hold it till the end just so we can keep rolling on it.
Chip, can I add just
Sure.
one thing? I did neglect to thank Louie Falso, who is...
Oh yeah, thank you
Louie,
for...
I'm sorry, Louie records our presentations and we post them on our Homeville YouTube page. So if anyone wasn't able to come, please direct them there. And would you like the lights off?
No. By the way, before we get started, can you hear us?
No.
Everybody hear you? We can
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Nobody's ever said you're too quiet, but there's always a first for that. We also just, by the way, quickly, we also want to acknowledge quickly, this presentation, as we said, this will be the 31st year we're doing it. There's a lot of people and folks that have helped us out over the years on it, even everybody who gives us permission to do things and assists us with helping the reading on the fourth go off of that edge. People like Ty Marshall at Center for the Arts, who literally gives us the Center for the Arts for the morning, provides us with everything, all the publicity that's helped over the years. It's really a community effort. We're just glad to be up front doing this. So we're going to start. We have a flag here. We have a flag up here with the Pledge of Allegiance. If you can stand, please. Great. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We're going to start out with a couple quick caveats and some basis for what we're doing. The first of which is a saying attributed to Michael Crichton, which is, if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it's part of a tree. It's something we've wrestled with over the years. Every year we wrestle with it, sadly, a little bit more. The second one, on a slightly more humorous note, and it's something we'll touch about too, is Mark Twain famously said, Herodotus says very few things happen at the right time and the rest do not happen at all. The conscientious historian will correct these defects. Part of what you struggle with when you do research for something like this is things that are attributed as fact either turn out not to be or tend to be attributed to the wrong event, and happens more than you think. So how did we get here? The short version is we weren't the first people to do a reading of the Declaration in Homer.
That happened at least as early as 1854. We found that there was basically a 6-hour program that included, among other things, lunch, a 3-hour sermon, prayer, and then the reading of the Declaration. And I read that in a Whig, an 1854 Whig paper, and that's when we sort of we decided really at that point to begin.
Yeah,
And that's how we got here.
we got here, he came up to me and said, as a shy teenager, we ought to do a public reading of the Declaration. And I said, what's this "we" you're talking about? I said, I'm not standing in front. He goes, yeah, we are. And as I've said to some of you, anytime my father says we're doing this, I can fight him, but I know in the end I'm going to lose. And I also know I'm probably going to enjoy it in the end. And so the first year we did it, it was one of the coldest and rainiest July 4ths we've ever had around here. There were 6 people gathered in the bandstand in Homer, and I think we were related to 3 of the other people. The other one of the other ones was a church member of ours, and the other one was the pastor of ours that had suggested to his congregation a year earlier that we ought to do a reading out loud of the Declaration. He said, go home, do it with your family. We did it as a family, and we were in tears by the time we did it. Which, by the way, I ought to mention, if you hear us get choked up on this when we do some of the quotes, it's powerful. And so we started out. Then we quickly did the Declaration the first year. We sang God Bless America. We ran for our cars because it was cold. And then the next year, a few more people came out, and a few more. And we started it out in the Homer Bandstand. We moved it inside to the Homer Congregational Church a few years later. They were wonderful hosts, great place, colonial style church. What better place to do a Declaration reading? And then, somebody came up to us and expressed concern that there was a separation of church and state issue, which is, if you hear how much religion went into the Declaration, it's a little... But we followed him. Thankfully, around the same time, Ty Marshall gave us a solution and offered to let us do it in the Center for the Arts. That's been great. We've had air conditioning for the first time, adequate sound systems. I no longer have to do sound. Along the way, we have had cannons. Peter Hartsock, John Hartsock's brother, used to bring a 50 caliber Coast Guard cannon, celebratory cannon. We used to fire it off on the green, and we did that until somebody called the police and said they really shouldn't do that anymore. We had a quarry one year doing Canada. Peter used to wear a colonial uniform, and one year he brought a buddy of his who was wearing his own grandfather's World War II uniform. That was great.
World War I.
Well, sorry, World War I.
Yeah.
I digress. And we had camera crews come. News media found out about it. They would come down from Syracuse. One year, Syracuse.com listed us as the top event in the region. The best thing, though, was because of that publicity, we once had a family on their vacation drive 3 hours out of their way to bring their kids. It was a mom and a dad. And they came up to us afterwards and said, we drove 3 hours out of our way because we want our kids to participate in something like this. And at that point, you go, that's why we're doing this. Over the years, we've had everybody read from 5 and 6 year olds. We do, at the end, when we do on July 4th, we let people come up and read parts. Hearing a 6-year-old try to say the word consanguinity is always one of my favorite parts. Usurpations. I mean, the poor kid looks at their parent like, what did you get me into? We've also had people into their 90s. And as we've done it for 31 years, the hard part is, we also have people who are no longer with us, who we look forward to doing it every year. We do it in the Bill Whiting Auditorium at the Center for the Arts. Bill, if any of you knew Bill was an eloquent orator. And so and he would come every year and read a bit. And it was always like hearing a master class in how to read the Declaration. So we've had a lot of fun over the years. So what are we talking about? Well, there's an apocryphal story that says that the King of England on July 4th wrote, in frustration to what was happening in the colonies, nothing happened this day. Number one, that's impossible. News didn't move that fast. Number two, it actually isn't the King of England. It's Louis of France talking about a hunting trip 14 years after the Declaration where nothing happened because he didn't catch anything that day. The reputation stands, but as we said, history is only history upon reflection. And the other question is, why not July 2nd, 1776, which is the day the Declaration was actually approved, voted on, or January 18th, 1777, which is the day in which the last signer actually signed the document?
Technically not. It's the day in which we know the identities of all the signers. It's the first time it's published.
You're going to hear us going back and forth like this, so just hang on. Grateful Remembrance.
Grateful Remembrance is what George Washington writes in a letter on July 20th, 1776, and he doesn't mention the Declaration of Independence, but he talks about a time when he is spared, the only time in which he surrendered, actually, as a military commander. And we'll talk a little about that when we get there. But Chip and I have really an impossible task. I mean, one could spend easily many hours going through these things. And as Chip said, each year we discover something new, we read a different book, we look up something different, and we find something that we had no idea. And this is also a story that takes 150 years from the time colonists come to this country and settle until there is a Declaration of Independence. It also is dependent on the nature of English colonies. Many European nations had colonies, and they were generally started because of a desire really for gold or spices or things like that. And the colonists were sent there, usually by a king. It was not their choice, and they were ruled and governed very strictly. In the case of England, England is very different because, in the first place, it's a constitutional monarchy. And one historian said that the way the British governed was salutary neglect, self-management, really. And the only way that the British really regulated their colonies was by controlling trade and shipping. And you'll see that a little bit. The other thing that's interesting is there was a war called King Philip's War. Mehmet, who is the son of, I just lost it, Massasoit. Massasoit's son calls himself Philip. And Philip takes over from his father after his father's death, of course. And in 1765, 1675, sorry, got that one. In 1675, the New England colonies primarily go to war against the Wampanoags. That's Philip's tribe, or Mehmet's tribe, and their allies. Over the course of about 3 years, there are really disastrous battles. And in the end...
Well, gruesome.
It's estimated that a third of the Massachusetts Bay houses are burned.
And that includes Maine.
Yeah, and that's Maine to basically New State. Yeah, Connecticut included. Approximately, the wealth that's lost is enormous. It takes the colonies at least 10 years to recover at that point. And but the horrible thing about it is so many people are killed. I mean, thousands of the Native Americans, the indigenous people, and approximately 2,500 colonists die during that period.
It essentially destroys all settlements in what we now know as Maine. It essentially wipes what now is Maine, what little bit, which I think goes up to about Portland or Gorham area. It basically reduces the size of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in a way that, as he said, the colony doesn't recover for decades.
But what's interesting about it is fought without mother colony intervention. It is fought, and what's really interesting is that's the first time independence is demonstrated in war, a kind of war.
You want to talk about salutary neglect?
No, I'll talk about that a little later.
Okay, so the 7 Years of War, we call it the French and Indian War, but what we're going to show is that's our part of it. It's not the first international war we've ever had on what we'll eventually call American soil. After King Philip's War, we had King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War, which are all partially fought on colonial soil, fought elsewhere, whether it's the Caribbean or somewhere else. But it's not the first. So a lot of times in history books we present 7 Years' War as the first big war. It's not. What is interesting is it's also the time, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, and it'll become clear. The colonists have already been over here for over a century at that point, and by that time have developed an identity. And because of that identity, what they're finding is they're not like their British brethren. And the Americans are now fighting side by side with the British regulars. And the way the British regulars, the British Army in those days was regimented, it's brutal in a way. And the Americans are a little, the colonists are a little horrified by the way the British even treat their own troops. It's a lack of a humanity in some cases. And they're also increasingly seeing during the course of this war, we're part of them, but maybe we're not. And it brings up a lot of questions. And this is also a war where we're going to see a lot of the individuals that will play critical roles in the Revolutionary War a couple of decades later, George Washington not being the least of them. Really, they're getting their military experience. But it's also where a lot of militia members are. If you read Nathaniel Philbrook's book, he talks about the farmers in Massachusetts Bay that fought during the 7 Years' War, and about 15 years later, when Governor Gage rebuilds the walls around Boston, some of the old grizzled farmers who had been militia members mock Gage's efforts, saying, well, you know, that's a wall, but that looks like a beaver dam compared to the siege at Louisbourg in Quebec during the war. Now, that was a battle. And these are guys who also realized by that point later on that they're sort of seasoned during the 7 Years' War, but will later have to gather arms again. As we said, the British are fighting side by side, but to give an idea of the 7 Years' War, sorry. Okay. Everything in blue is Great Britain, Portugal, and their allies. Everything in green is controlled by France, and their allies being Spain, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and others.
And this is what we call the French and Indian War, but as you can see, it's really the First World War.
This map gives you an idea of the various empires: Spanish, Portuguese, British, Russian, Dutch, Ottoman, French. The areas with hash marks over them in North America, Central Europe, and even India are the areas that the 7 Years' War consumes. The only area that this doesn't include, and it was a hotbed, was the entire Caribbean, was also another theater of the war. Wars like this are not cheap. They require a lot. It takes a lot out of an empire, even one with a lot of money like Great Britain. The war at first doesn't look like it's going to go in Great Britain's favor. Quebec falls in 1759 and Montreal finally in 1760. What it also does is it leaves the Britain with incredible debt and an incredibly bad financial situation. And so that brings us to, which will come into conflict. But we're going to pause at this point and talk about an increasingly American identity.
Okay, you skipped a lot.
Whoa, okay, then go back.
Anyway, no,
go back.
We're not going to go back.
No, wait a minute, what did I skip?
We skipped about governance and things like that.
Okay, so let's talk about that. That's important. That's important.
We're going to argue back and forth.
That's important. No, that's the important part. You understand?
Let me just say it very quickly. Part of the developing American identity, and we'll get to George Whitefield, but there's a distinct advantage in being separated from the mother colony. Britain is 3,000 miles away, and as I mentioned earlier, the British settlers are there by choice. England is a tiny place, and it's starting to get crowded And one of the reasons why the colonists are encouraged is because land is very scarce. And much of the land is owned by the royalty, nobility. And so there's not much room for farmers. As well, the Brits are traders. And so companies sponsor colonists. For example, in Canada, still today, there's the Hudson's Bay Colony. It's still a growing business operation. And that was one of the companies that sent colonists to what we now call Canada. So there's that, and that's very important. As well, the British are there for other reasons. Remember I said generally the European nations are sending their colonists there to take. The British colonists are going there for other purposes. One is farming, one is to have land of their own. Another important reason is religious liberty. So you have Maryland settled by Catholics, you have Pennsylvania settled by the Quakers, the Puritans go to New England, and there's this sense of independence from the Stuart kings, who are not well loved, and their bishops. And so you have that sense of freedom. And that's something that leads into what we're calling the American identity. Washington was also remembering his part in the 7 Years' War, and we don't have time really to talk about that. But one day we will talk more about that.
Actually, come to the reading on the 4th, because we will talk about it. Essentially, Washington is remembering a moment in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, where he was pinned down and nearly killed. And by Providence, they all lived to see another day. And Washington considers that moment a critical day really in his life. And even years later, when Washington talks about a day of celebration, he's still talking about it decades later.
Okay, but as Chip said, wars are very expensive. And so Britain now considers that it has protected these colonies. And so the colonies owe money. And so in response to that, the 1764 Sugar Act is passed. That's a tax on non-British goods. And the Currency Act, which prohibits native currency. And a cry against taxation without representation in Parliament is first heard in the Massachusetts Bay Colony town meeting, and a call for united protest throughout the colonies. That's 1764. In 1765, the Stamp Act, and you'll see the acts later, we're going to run them very quickly, but Parliament's first direct tax on newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, legal documents, dice, and playing cards. The response was a network of secret organizations, a spy network known as, anybody know? Sons of Liberty. And they aim at intimidating the stamp agents who collect the tax. Massachusetts Assembly called for a joint meeting to work for the act's repeal, and 9 colonies responded. The Stamp Act Congress, as it was called, passed a, quote, Declaration of Rights and Grievances that asserted that Americans were equal to all other British citizens and deserved parliamentary representation. This is 1765.
Apologies for going through these. As you can see, it wasn't the first act. Navigation Act.
But these were not taxation.
Okay,
These
well,
were
Molasses
basically
Act is.
regulations. Molasses Act, yes.
Currency Act limits new currency.
Native currency.
Native currency. Sugar Act amends the act, also requires, and then the Stamp Act raises the revenue. That brings us, and again, anytime you have rancor, you then have to bring in control. So we get the 1765 Quartering Act, who then, it essentially says soldiers can take over any residence they want to. Going ahead just briefly to explain why the Quartering Act was so important, I'm going to jump ahead nearly 10 years to explain it. At some point it becomes a necessity. When the British soldiers come into Boston in 1774, the winter is quickly coming on, and even with a lot of patriots leaving the city, what the British Army realizes is there's not only not enough places to keep them during the winter time, but all the carpenters are patriots. And so in one moment of desperation, Governor Gage reaches out to John Hancock, of all people, and said, basically, can you get these carpenters to build us places? The carpenters won't. As a result, not only the soldiers, but the soldiers' wives and children die at a rate that one source puts it, sometimes 4 soldiers a day from the cold. A lot of them are living in tents out on Boston Common in the middle of the Massachusetts winter. So while the colonists view the Quartering Act as oppressive, the British view it as almost a necessity.
Okay, let's go to George Whitefield.
Okay, you want to go back? Okay.
Okay, I'm going to read just because that's the only way we're going to get through this. In November 1739, George Whitefield arrived in Pennsylvania on his second visit to the colonies. What's interesting is when he comes into Philadelphia, 4,000 people meet him. 4,000, not until the Beatles arrive at Idlewild Airport 200 years later, would anyone arriving from Britain be greeted by 4,000 people. Isn't that amazing? Okay, expelled from the churches of England because of the Church of England, because of his message and his methods, he had been forced to preach in British fields. The consequence was that his congregations were no longer limited in size by the dimensions of a building, and his voice was the envy of every actor and orator. Benjamin Franklin was skeptical of the reports that he could be heard by audiences numbering in the tens of thousands. Whitefield at this point, preaches to 30,000 people in Scotland at one time. 30,000. Franklin, skeptical, calculates the size of the crowd that could hear him one evening in Philadelphia, and Franklin calculates it to be, in fact, 30,000 people. In the colonies, Whitefield continued his practice of preaching twice a day and 4 times on Sundays. And this is why it's important. This is before there's an internet. His message was that everyone was equal in God's sight, and that's why he got kicked out of the Church of England, that all, whether royalty or commoners, must be born again. His preaching, though, was not only a great social leveler, it was also a great uniter of the colonists. During this second visit to the colonies, he rode 2,000 miles on horseback. His ride from New York to Charleston was the longest any white man had ever ridden in North America. He traveled 3,000 miles by boat. He preached 350 times officially and gave many other talks. Whitefield visited 75 cities, and everywhere he preached, he said that people must accept their new identity in Christ. They were not, and he specifically said, they were not Germans, they were not French, they were not English, but instead they were all equal in God's sight. All were Americans, he said, an identity that was separate from one's ethnicity or one's denomination. The idea that everyone could have a direct relationship with God and that all were equal before God led to the idea that earthly authorities could be judged and should be judged. If God was the ultimate judge and the judge above all other judges, then surely each person should consider whether those in authority over him were exercising that authority in accordance with God's principles, or if not in accordance with God's principles, which is to say in a way that could be considered tyrannous. And he used these words. The idea of sovereignty was an unprecedented development in their political thought. Whitefield eventually would make 13 trips to the colonies, and by the time he died in 1770, and this is the astounding number, it is estimated that 80% of the colonists would hear him preach in person. That's 80% of the colonists. So they were hearing this message. In his 33 years of preaching in the colonies, he delivered 18,000 sermons, along with 12,000 talks and exhortations. Whitefield's preaching might be said to have fostered an American people. There was no unifying intercolonial person or event before Whitefield, and no other name other than that of royalty that was known equally from Boston to Charleston. His teachings affirmed a suspicious view of authority and a particular revelation of tyranny, such that the colonists were ready to stand up to the perceived aggressions of the mother country and even take up arms if necessary. Townshend Act. Townshend Act were attempts to pay for the expenses involved in governing the American colonies by taxing imports of glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. These indignities eventually led to the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770, in which a group of British soldiers opened fire on an unfriendly crowd, killing 3 colonists and fatally wounding 2 more. The responsible soldiers were tried for murder, but convicted of lesser crimes. Their principal defense lawyer was John Adams.
The Boston Massacre is an interesting event because it's one of the first in American history where we still have the transcripts. Because it was an actual trial, you can still find the transcripts of the trial. What's interesting is the Boston Massacre gets presented as a black and white situation. It's not. The area outside of the State House in Boston, it's a very small, even in those days, without all the skyscrapers that exist there today, it's a very small, relatively small spot. On that night, it was dark. I mean, it's an evening in early March. It's dark, it's cold. There are regulars protecting the State House, and a group of essentially what the British consider a rabble come up and try to start antagonizing them. They're accusing them of things. It's dark. It's 5 or 6 soldiers. And all of a sudden you have a crowd of hundreds around you. And all of a sudden somebody says something and one of the soldiers takes his musket and hits the colonist. And that's all they need. At that point, rocks are being thrown, bottles are being thrown, and all of a sudden guns go off. And at that point, everything breaks loose. The British soldiers are tried. Thomas Preston, who was the head of the British soldiers that night, was accused of standing out in front of them and leading, having given the charge to fire. What Preston says in the trial, though, is he goes, "I couldn't have said it. Not only I couldn't have said it, I wouldn't have said fire because I was directly in front of the guns and they would have killed me in the process." So it must have been something else. The reason it ends in an acquittal for everybody and only manslaughter for 2 is that there just aren't enough facts to prove that the British soldiers did it. And this angers a lot of patriots. It also angers a lot of patriots that one of the defense attorneys that gets them off the hook is one of their own folks in Abs. Josiah Quincy, the other attorney, is a loyalist, as the patriot turned loyalist. And part of, as we've seen in American trial, with other trials since, you get a decision that the populace doesn't like, and it just heats things up a bit more. By 1770, and again, during this time, more and more British soldiers are pouring into Boston. They're pouring into other areas, and that leads us to 1773 and the Tea Act.
And the response to the Tea Act is the Boston Tea Party. December 16, 1773, and that is it eliminates the tax on imported British tea, and it was seen as giving an unfair advantage over colonial tea sellers. East India Company tea arrives, the colonists demand that it be returned, and the royal governor insists that it be landed. On December 16th, men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded the ship, dump all the tea into the harbor. From this incident, and this is important, committees of correspondence were set up to keep all the colonists apprised of the latest resistance movement. And what do you think their slogan was? No king, but King Jesus. And remember, George Whitefield has just died 3 years before.
As we're talking about ramping up, and I'll give a shorter version of what I talked about on July 4th, we mentioned Sons of Liberty. A lot of what we know as the Sons of Liberty is what has been in part driven by the movie Johnny Tremaine that Disney did in the early 60s, that presents the Sons of Liberty as this friendly little group of almost Boy Scout-like patriots, when in fact that couldn't be farther from the truth. The Sons of Liberty go after then Governor Thomas Hutchinson. They destroy his business, and if that's not enough, when he still doesn't coerce to them, they go after his house, which at that point is known to have the largest repository of colonial history documents in the colonies.
First edition.
First edition.
Primary sources.
He's already at that point written volume 1 of his history of the colonies. He's writing the course of 2. They take his extensive library, throw it out on the street, and burn it. And what we later realized, historians later realized, is many of the documents burned that night were one-of-a-kind primary documents that were destroyed. One source says, the last time we did the presentation, we talked about when somebody says, this is how much it cost in 1770. Last time we were here, one of the people in the audience was Jim Price, who was the former head of the SU Economics Department. And essentially what Jim said is, it's hard to convert dollars then to now. It's virtually impossible. What people think is the value of Hutchinson's library was somewhere between the hundreds of thousands or even more, in part because it was one-of-a-kind documents. That was pulled out on the street. Tar and feathering was a general tactic used in that era. One of the worst incidents happens a little ahead of us in 1774, where one individual was literally taken, stripped, covered in tar. And this isn't coal tar. This isn't like roofing patch. This is tar heated up in a furnace and then put on you. And again, in an era before solvents, it's not going anywhere. And essentially what it does is boils your skin. And once the people get on, it not only doesn't come off, but when it does come off, your skin is essentially coming off of it, not to be too graphic, to the point where people either get injured or they die from their injuries. And so this is a group that, while they're trying to get the point across, they're doing it in some very extreme ways. You know, when the British react to those, the Patriots sort of somewhat say, well, we don't get it. So that leaves us to 1774 and the Coercive or Intolerable Acts.
The British respond to the Boston Tea Party with the Intolerable Acts, intended to punish Boston. They banned loading or unloading ships in the harbor. They allowed royal officials to transfer court cases brought against them in Massachusetts to England, and they put the election of most government officials under Crown control, essentially eliminating the Massachusetts Charter of Government. And again, while there is this movement toward independence, the British are starting to really clamp down, tax, and restrict. In that same year, 1774, the Committees of Correspondence, remember, established the First Continental Congress that met with 12 colonies, 56 delegates. Georgia only is not represented. The first meeting was a prayer meeting. The Articles of Association of 1774, its first accomplishment, urged all colonists not to buy imported British goods And its second major accomplishment was the establishment of the Second Continental Congress, and that's in 1775.
One of the important events that happens during the First Continental Congress is the Suffolk Resolves. On September 9th, 1774, at Vose's Tavern in Milton, Massachusetts, the committees of correspondence from Suffolk, Middlesex, Essex, and Worcester counties and Massachusetts gather and essentially do an early version of the section in the Declaration that talks about the grievances and the complaints. At the same time, what's interesting is Resolution 16 also expresses the ambiguity here. And again, we've talked a lot about, we have the Patriots on one side, we have the Loyalists on the other. They still live with each other. And in some cases, families are divided. We'll talk about that a little more later. Resolution 17 is especially interesting, that this county, confiding in the wisdom and integrity of the Continental Congress now sitting in Philadelphia, will pay all due respect and submission to such measures as may be recommended by them to the colonies for the restoration and establishment of our just rights, civil and religious, and for the renewing that harmony and union between Great Britain and the colonies so earnestly wished for all good men. It's approved by the committees of correspondence on September 9th, and interestingly enough, brought to Philadelphia by a guy named Paul Revere, who is a friend of Joseph Warren, who's a head of the committee of correspondence, and who literally, whose horseback riding skills a year before his other famous act literally helps get the news there quicker than they said, even than the British could transmit news at that point. It's approved by the First Continental Congress during their session on September 17, 1774.
Revere rides to, from Boston to Philadelphia in 10 days, and that's 200 miles, which is a very good ride. And that's the first of his rides, and that's the first time we see Paul Revere appear. In 1775, the British began to fortify Boston and seize ammunition belonging to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Hundreds of American militiamen were ready to resist, but no fighting occurred. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress had established a special committee of safety to decide when the militia groups known as Minutemen should be called into action. On March 23rd, 1775, Patrick Henry speaks. We're going to try to speed this up. I mean,
We're going to try to speed this up.
It's impossible. While Chip is looking, let me just talk about Paul Revere. On April 18, 1775, so this is the next month, Revere eventually makes 18 rides. We only think of one, but one is to Manhattan, one is to Philadelphia, and then there are 16 within basically the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And Billy Dawes, separately, they head to Lexington to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams that British troops were coming from Boston to arrest them and then proceed on to Concord. Hancock and Adams had met with the Massachusetts Provincial Congress in Concord earlier that evening. Wary of returning to Boston, they had stayed in Lexington at what is now known as the Hancock-Clark House. Hancock carried with him a trunk full of seditionary papers. I mean, these were the names of the Patriots, their correspondence, and other documents outlining the Continental Congress's defense strategy. The papers contained written evidence that would have incriminated many of the leaders. And Revere's shout is, the British are coming, and it's in fact, hide the trunk. Well, you don't hear that when you're in high school, but there it is. The trunk is upstairs in the Buckman Tavern on the Lexington Green, and it was so heavy that it was all that Revere and Hancock could do to get it out of the room and down the stairs. They dragged it through the ranks of the Minutemen on the Commons, to the nearby woods and Revere wrote later that musket balls were flying over their heads. The leather-covered trunk actually survived. The Worcestershire Historical Museum actually has it, and they exhibit it every day on Patriots' Day. Hancock and Adams escaped to Burlington, Massachusetts. Revere and Dawes were joined by Dr. Samuel Prescott. The three were detained, but Prescott escapes and makes it to Concord, where the arsenal was.
I'm going to jump back into this point. By the way, and this is a very quick version of it. The way this date was made possible for the Patriots is the Patriots, by this point, gunpowder was a very hard thing to make. It was also hard to get. And the moment the British started arriving in Boston a couple of years earlier, they basically done everything they could to take any sort of firearms, guns, cannons, and gunpowder into their own control. At the same time, each one of the towns outside of Boston had their own supply of gunpowder. What they don't have a lot of is cannons. And just a couple of moments that we debate between ourselves. It's not really a light moment, but it gives you the idea of desperation they were under. At one point, the Patriots realized there were some cannons on Boston Common. And so literally, while the British soldiers are, if you can believe this, on break, they break into the gun house and steal two 500-pound cannons, roll them out into the woods, and then spirit them away. The British sergeant after the event, and I just love this, his quote was, "I'll be damned if those people wouldn't steal the teeth out of your head while you're on guard." Billy Dawes, who's the other rider with Paul Revere a few months later, is one of the guys carrying the cannons, and the cannons are so heavy, it drives the shirt button into his wrist and injures his wrist. And when Joseph Warren, who was the head of the committees of correspondence and actually a medical doctor, Billy Dawes goes to Warren to get his wrist looked at, and Dr. Warren literally essentially says, "Billy, what did you do?" And then when Dawes is silent, he said, "You know what, it's probably better I don't know what you did." A few months later, the Patriots, being desperate, took some rusty cannons and they tried putting them in a flatboat and floating them out of the north end of Boston. The boat mires out on the mud in the middle of the night. Admiral Graves seizes them. The person whose boat it was takes the British Navy to court and said, "The British Navy took my boat with my cannons in it." To their credit, the court actually rules that the British Navy had no right to do it. And again, it's more frustration than contention, but what Gage's governor later argues is in part due to decisions like that, the colonists are protesting them, but at the same time, it's British law that's helping them arm up. But going back to Patrick Henry, the debate is going on in Congress at this point. And so Patrick Henry, before the Virginia House of Burgesses, gives his speech, which is partially frustration, and ends with, "It is vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears a clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death."
Remember, this is March 1775, and we're back now at Lexington. On April 19th, at about 4 a.m., with no sleep, 700 British regulars leave Cambridge. At dawn on Lexington Common, they meet a line of 70 Minutemen. In 15 minutes, 3 Minutemen were dead. The British march on to Concord, arriving before 11 a.m. There the Minutemen stand, forcing a retreat of the British back to Bunker Hill that took most of the day with the harassing fire of the colonials. By the end of the day, there were 250 British casualties compared to nearly 100 of the Minutemen. And what's interesting is when we talk about Hancock and Adams fleeing, they're fleeing in part because if the British troops catch them, you know what the punishment for treason is? It's hanging, it's drawing and quartering. You know what drawing and quartering is? They hook a horse to one arm,
While you're alive.
another horse to another arm, and another hook to each of your legs, and then they run the horses apart.
While you're still living.
And that's a standard punishment for treason. And so that's why they're trying to get away. Why they're trying to save the trunk, because it has all these names in it. Okay, on June 15th, so this is now...
Well, on May 9th, we captured Fort Ticonderoga, which is
Okay,
critical.
we should say that.
Because going to what we were just saying about cannons, Ethan Allen and, of all people, Benedict Arnold, who's still a patriot at that point, capture Fort Ticonderoga, and most importantly, get the cannons from it. On May 9th, you're on 10th, the second
Yeah,
Continental.
okay, on May 10th, the Second Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia, and John Hancock is the presiding officer. And again, it follows a very lengthy prayer meeting. It's about a 3-hour-long prayer meeting. Again, remember, drawing and quartering, hanging, I mean, it is not a prospect that one chooses. On June 15th, George III declares the colonists to be rebellious and seditious, and makes plans to send, at that point, the British had hired 18,000 Hessian mercenaries.
Hessian mercenaries are a scary bunch. Hessian
We
mercenaries.
are descendants of Hessian mercenaries.
Okay, so first of all, full disclosure, thank you to the British Army for letting us be here. Hessian mercenaries are considered vicious. They are truly mercenaries for hire. The British soldiers themselves are scared of the Hessians.
When Hessians take prisoners, they use their bayonets and they stick them into the nearest building with you in between.
They pin you to the nearest building.
Basically, they don't waste gunpowder, and
At the same time, what's interesting is when some of the Hessians, including our forefather, were taken prisoner, the Americans, in an act truly of graciousness, give them, at the end of the war, with a lot of the British prisoners, including the Hessians, say, you can either go back to your country or you can stay here. Some people, like our ancestor, decided to stay here, Americanized the name and stayed here. So again, while both the British and the Americans are scared of these guys, there is still some graciousness by the end of the war. But they are truly a vicious group, but it also shows to the British desperation that they feel like they need somebody like this. One thing we truly didn't mention, and again, to keep it fair to the loyalists, is as you read about the efforts on both sides, there is genuine fear on the loyalist part. Things are getting very rough in Boston. Last time we gave the talk, we compared Boston during the early 1770s to Belfast, Ireland in the 20th century. It's truly a place of, you don't know who you're living next to, what they may do if you say something wrong. Mobs on both sides are common in Boston by 1774. People are literally afraid for their lives to even live their lives. It leads a lot of people to either leave Boston or come to Boston as a sense of security. It's a mess. So that leads us to the Second Continental Congress.
okay, George has declared the colonists to be rebellious and seditious, and there's the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill, which is really what the projection is. Anyway, that's engaged by British General William Howe. By the end of the day, the British were victors, but lost 1,054 of 2,200 troops at that point. The Americans lost about 441 of about 3,000. This is one of the few times during the war when the Americans have actually more troops in the field than the British do. The Northern Continental Congress delegates favor independence, but the Southerners do not. And so John Adams ensured Southern support by suggesting a Southern commander, and that's George Washington.
And remember, part of that not being approved in it, the South still has a primarily agrarian society in that case, and their main trading partner is Britain.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned things like how many people are living. The estimate is there are about 2 million colonists, of which about 500,000 are slaves. And at that point, Britain has about 8 million people. So Britain is about 4 times as large as the colonies. So Washington is appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and he leaves for Cambridge. The Continental Congress offers the Olive Branch Petition that declares loyalty to the king and asks for his help in redressing grievances in order to prevent further hostilities. And 4 months later, George III rejects it. And so at that point, there's the threat of 18,000 Hessians coming. There's the thrill of the American victories and the outlook for political and economic freedom. And Colonel Henry Knox goes to Fort Ticonderoga and hauls these mortars back.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're now at 1776. In April...
well, you missed January.
Well, I'm going to let that go.
All right.
In April, the British evacuated Boston. They and the Continental Army head to New York. And Washington, at that point, has 7,000 fit troops. In the next winter, he will have only 2,000 at Valley Forge. And at that point, the British have 34,000. Okay, so 34,000 compared to 7,000.
Fit troops are always going to be a problem from Washington during the war.
And for the British, too.
And for the British.
Which is why they hired the Hessians.
I mean, just graphically, but truly, we don't think about. Hygiene in both camps is so horrible. Washington claims that you could smell the army camps before you meet them. But what that also means is, and it's a problem we wrestled with during the Civil War, is bad hygiene means bad health. Bad health means you don't have soldiers. It's a problem.
Okay, as late as May of 1776, the Continental Congress had no plans to break away from England. Troops under Washington's command had been fighting the British for nearly a year, yet in Philadelphia there was a mighty bloc known as the Reconciliationists. And it's led by John Dickinson, who is a wonderful patriot, and if you ever want to read a good biography, read it about Dickinson. But Dickinson does his best to convince the other members of Congress that we need to stay with Britain. We are British. We are British. But there's a group of activists led by Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, assisted by, and he's often characterized as nervous, John Adams. And they plot how to bring about American independence over the course of the next 9 weeks. So this is May, and it'll go 9 weeks. The Adamses formed an alliance with the Philadelphian outsiders and the elegant British planners, Virginia planners, I'm sorry, to demand liberty.
One reason they're still divided is, and this is a classic question, who's patriot, who's not, who's in between. The original theory was 30-30, one-third, one-third, one-third. That's one of the fallacies. It's actually American Opinions on the French Revolution. Comes from a misquote from John Adams. I had numbers written down from 10 years ago. I looked to see if the internet could do any better. The internet, its infinite wisdom, is giving me math that doesn't add to 100% anymore. Roughly, the conventional wisdom between scholars now is that 40 to 45% were patriots. Some think as high as 55%. 30 to 45% may have been neutral. Again, that seems to be about consensus. And anywhere between 15 and 25% are loyalists. Again, as people say, though, when somebody might pin you to the wall with a bayonet, do you really want to give your truthful opinion? And what you often read is that sometimes people on both sides were quietly sympathetic to the other side.
Okay, May 15th, the Virginia Convention votes for independence, and Congress reconvenes, and on June 7th, and can we show them the Richard Henry Lee resolution? Go to the end.
Which one is that?
Going to the last paragraph.
I'll try not to whiplash you too bad through the declaration.
But we've got to get you through.
I know.
Okay. Okay. Right there.
Okay.
This is in
It's the part in dark.
dark, yeah.
It's known as the Lee Resolution.
Richard Henry Lee resolves and is seconded by John Adams Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. That's voted 4 days later, and some of the delegates are still bound by earlier instructions to pursue a path of reconciliation. So consideration is postponed by a vote of 7 colonies to 5, with New York abstaining. Congress was recessed for 3 weeks, although the tone of debate indicated that the resolution would be adopted. And come to the reading and we'll read you some of that. But anyway, a committee of 5, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Robert R. Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut are appointed to draft what is a statement presenting to the world the colonists' case for independence. The committee decides that Jefferson, John Adams wrote that he had a, quote, particular felicity of expression, end quote, should write the draft, and Adams and Franklin would edit it. Jefferson wrote what is known as a fair copy, reports it to the committee, and from them it's unaltered to the Congress. The fair copy, we don't know what the fair copy, it doesn't exist, so we don't know exactly what Jefferson wrote originally. And this painting is often called the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but it's really when the Committee of 5 are standing in front of John Hancock's desk and presenting the work that they've done. That day, the Maryland Convention votes for independence, and New Jersey recalls its old delegates and sends new ones with instructions to vote for independence. On July 1st, Congress enters what John Adams called the greatest debate of all. And again, come to the, we'll read that more at the reading.
Again, come to July 4th for some of this.
As the British land on Staten Island, and this is July 2nd, the Lee Resolution is adopted by 12 colonies, with New York abstaining. Consideration of the Declaration began immediately with the process of revision, continuing through all of July 3rd and into the late afternoon of July 4th. Congress made, we know they made alterations, and we're told in our readings that 86 alterations are made. About 500 words are eliminated from Jefferson's work, including a long attack on the British people and a long charge concerning the slave trade. The final handwritten document of 1,337 words was adopted and probably was signed simply with, by the order and in behalf of the Congress, by John Hancock as president and Charles Thompson as secretary. Okay, the handwritten document is sent a few blocks away to the print shop of John Dunlap. I'm going to hold the Dunlap.
The smaller one or the larger?
Yeah, the smaller
smaller
one. Dunlap that night prints what's known as the Dunlap broadside, between 150 and 200 copies. And one is sent to George Washington on July 6th, and he has it read to the troops in New York City. On July 9th, the action of Congress is approved by the New York Convention, so all 13 colonies have now signified their approval. A copy reached London on August 10th. 26 Dunlap broadsides are known to exist today. The last one sold for about $12 million, and it was sold many years ago, so who knows what the value of the Dunlap broadside is. Anyway, we don't have the original handwritten copy. On July 19th, Congress orders that a copy be fairly engrossed on parchment with the title and style of the Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. And Timothy Matlock, the assistant to the secretary, writes it by hand. Most of the delegates sign it on of the second in geographic order of their colonies, from north to south, right to left. Though some delegates were not present and had to sign later, 2 delegates never signed it at all. As new delegates joined the Congress, they were also allowed to sign. A total of 56 eventually signed it, and the engrossed copy is now on display at the National Archives. On January 18, 1777, the Continental Congress orders the Declaration be more widely distributed. The second printing is made by the first woman printer in the United States, and it includes, the first one did only include Hancock's and Thompson's names, but the second one includes everyone's. Okay, you want to show that? Hold that up.
We're going to give you a very quick version.
You can come and see this, but in 1823, the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who's John's son, commissioned William Stone to produce an engraving of the document identical to the original. Stone's copy was apparently made using what's called wetting transfer process, where the surface of the document is moistened. Remember, this is ink. And then a copper plate is put on the face of it, and it pulls away the ink, and then from that, a plate is run on a press.
And that's why you
So
have
when
a
you
faded
see-
document.
Yeah, when you see a printed copy of the Declaration of Independence, that's from William Stone's copy. Because of the poor preservation and conservation of the 1776 document, and it looks like this actually. From 1776 to 1921, the Declaration is moved from city to city. During the war, it's rolled up and carried in a leather pouch.
At one point, it's literally patched together with Scotch tape.
Yeah, eventually.
It hangs in the office of, it hangs in an office in Washington. The building has a fire. Barely makes it out. One thing we mentioned, it's one of the documents that barely makes it out of Washington during the War of 1812 when the British sieged Washington. It's literally amazing. At one point, it hangs in direct sunlight for 50 years
Yeah.
and bleaches out even more.
Anyway, this is what we have now. This is made from the last transparency that the National Archives allowed to be made. So if you go to the National Archives Rotunda and they have the document on display, that's exactly what it looks like. And then we're going to close with this. On July 4th, 1826, Thomas Jefferson, after having been comatose for days, awakes.
Okay, this is one of the parts. We didn't even do John Adams' speech from July 4th. Come and you can hear me nearly cry doing that. Jefferson and Adams are the last 2 signers still alive, and it's July 4th, 1826. As Dad said, Jefferson's been comatose for days, and he awakes out of his coma and asks, "Is it the 4th?" and dies shortly thereafter. Adams, unbeknownst to Jefferson, is also on his deathbed, and some say his last words were, "Thomas Jefferson lives," not realizing that he had actually survived Jefferson by a few hours. The 2 had been enemies, political enemies, for years.
For those, yeah.
For those last few years, but in the end, old soldiers, so to speak. The Declaration, we're going to quickly get you through this. Again, we want you to come on July 4th. Come read it, it's great. The Declaration is divided up into several sections. You want to give them the...
Well, this is the title and style.
Explain to them what a style is, because even I couldn't remember what it was.
It's the,
In Congress,
yeah, what you see.
1776.
Yeah.
United States. We have an introduction. When in the course, well,
You know that one.
you know that.
That's probably what you memorized.
You have the preamble.
Yeah. In which a lot of the This comes, in fact, from George Whitefield, and also Thomas Paine, Common Sense, and from John Locke, because they're known by Jefferson. Anyway, a lot of these words are right out of Whitefield, Paine, and Locke.
Okay, the document, the first section.
Then you have a section of about 30 grievances.
This is similar to that Suffolk resolves from
Yeah,
1774.
this is what King George has done. And we know that Jefferson wanted to blame the British people, but Congress didn't want to do that. So that's much of those 500 words that were taken out.
By the way, I promise this is the last time I'm going to interject. He talked about the fact that we don't include the outright attack on the British people, which is critical. We don't include slavery because we need a compromise that will get the Southerners to vote for us. The other thing we don't mention is Adams, what's her name? Abigail Adams writes her husband and basically says, "We would hope that you would remember the ladies during this process because men, if left to their own means, would be tyrants." But and she does it in a way that only Abigail Adams
she writes that.
Yeah, basically says, "Look, we're here."
Yeah.
But what's interesting, we say it on a solemn note, is there's the verse in the Bible that talks about the sins of the fathers are visited upon the third and fourth generations. And what do Americans wrestle with for the next 200 years? Slavery, racial issues, women's rights.
What do we still
wrestle with? And we said, again, while we're glad that there are some parts that they don't put in and you look at it and also go, could they have done it? Should they have done it? What are we still wrestling today? We're wrestling with stuff they don't put in this document. It's interesting. More
grievances?
Again, this is just bottled up frustration. Second part, look.
And it says, we've tried our best to make peace with you.
We really want to be a part of you. We still love you all. I mean, really what it's saying is, we still want to be a part of you, but you're making it impossible for us to be. And leading up to, therefore, we have no choice but to,
Let's read this in unison, okay? This is not much, but let's go. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
And then they sign their names on it. And as John Hancock will say at the end, the price on my head has just been doubled, but it's really true. They're signing their death warrants. And afterwards, once the king does get a copy of it, he puts a death warrant out on every single one of these. And if we don't have time, but if we did, let's go back and look at that last line. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They've signed their fate at this point. We could spend an hour alone on what happened to these guys. If you're Caesar Rodney, who we didn't go into the detail on, but you're the delegate that rides through stormy conditions, 80 miles of mud storm, goes through 3 horses in the middle of the night to break what's known as the Delaware deadlock and allow for a unanimous vote, other than good old New York's abstention for months. New York, by the way, abstains for months afterwards, which, well, again, talk about nothing ever changes. But Caesar Rodney comes through and they get him so he'll vote.
Listen, Chip has interrupted me, so I'm gonna interrupt him a little.
Yeah.
Rodney has cancer of the face. And in 1765, there's an operation, and it's a very crude operation, and basically destroys his face. And so the rest of his life, he wears a scarf over his face. Okay. What's interesting too is that cancer continues to progress. Eventually kills him in like 1783, I think. But the surgeons who are capable of doing the best surgery in the world at that point are in Britain. And Rodney is signing his death warrant. And he recognizes that. And by the way, if you find a Delaware quarter, on the back of it there's a man on horseback. That's Caesar Rodney. And so the state of Delaware honors him. And Rodney still participates. He's head of the militia for Delaware. He becomes president of Delaware, in effect the governor of Delaware. And finally just, the cancer gets him, and as I said, I think he dies in 1783. But when they say we mutually pledge to each other, and John Adams writes to Abigail on July 3rd and says basically this: we don't know what's going to happen to us. We hope it turns out for good. It may not be good, but in the end, we've done it.
Most of them, their families are hunted down, their houses are burned. They give money to the American cause. They're never paid back.
There's two who were never paid back, and ended up in poverty. They were wealthy and kept the revolution going. And to end on a more positive note, we're concluding here, this is only the beginning of the process. We have the Articles of Confederation come up a few years later, which in some cases does more confounding and frustrating than it helps. We have the Bill of Rights, we have the Constitution, but as we always say, this is an act in progress. I mean, the Constitution alone has 23 amendments. So you get the Constitution, they go, oh, so we forgot this. Hey, we should change this. But that's the beauty of this government they're setting up. The hardest thing we've had to deal with in the past 31 years is, even in that amount of time, perspectives change. How we do this change. And one of the criticisms we've gotten is people say, well, these guys weren't perfect. No, and they would be the first ones to tell you that. We talk about in one of the documents, and this is where I'm going to show my lack of literacy, toward a more perfect union. And I always cite that's the aspiration. What they're saying is, look, we don't know what we're doing. In some cases, like John Adams, he'll say during the debates, look, there's got to be somebody better than me who can do it. But since there's not, I'm going to give it my best shot. And that's what all these guys are doing with the Declaration, with all the subsequent documents. That's what we're still doing 250 years later. And I think sometimes we don't, sadly enough, cut ourselves enough slack. No, we don't.
We're not. The sad thing is, the thing that's too bad is it's a bunch of human beings. But this gives us something to aim for. Look, if we do the best we can, maybe we can get a little bit farther down the road. So that's the Declaration.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Well, let me say one thing. Let me ask you a question. Where are most of the battles of the Revolutionary War fought? What colonies?
New York.
Pardon?
New York.
Okay, New York is one of them.
Massachusetts.
No, New Jersey, and in fact South Carolina. There are engagements in all the colonies, but the major battles are fought in New York, New Jersey, and South Carolina. And we don't think of that. We don't think of New York State. I mean, probably, unless you've been to a talk like this, or you've read, or you've watched Ken Burns. What is it, 6 programs?
Right.
Anyway, it's extraordinary, and it's extraordinary what they do, and it's what Chip says. Not only are they imperfect, but they also have to compromise, and they have to get all these people together, and there are 56.
Some of these guys genuinely hate each other.
Eventually, yeah, I mean they do. That's the interesting thing about Adams and Jefferson dying on the same day, July 4th, 1826. They hated each other. They were bitter enemies for decades. And yet, you know, in the end, they recognized who they were and what they were doing and how important it was. So, anyway, lots of amazing
Questions?
Jefferson is very young. I think Jefferson is 33.
Jefferson's one of the youngest, Franklin,
Yeah.
of course, the old
Franklin
man.
is 80.
Franklin's the old man.
Yeah.
So,
You know, it's extraordinary. And they come from all these colonies and all these backgrounds. Some are lawyers, some are clergy, some are
questions, thoughts?
judges. Anyway, yeah, we've talked enough. We've talked more than enough. Jamie has left us 2 hours ago.
Anybody thoughts, any questions?
I have a thought on it.
Sure.
I saw a commercial for what looked like a Ben Franklin movie. And so I said, well, let's go watch it. We like this era.
Yeah.
It turned out to be all about George Whitefield.
Huh.
And the whole 2 hours was about George Whitefield. I'd never heard of him before, that movie. And then you got him here.
The
I'd like to ask the question
Sure.
to us, how many have seen A Great Awakening?
Yeah, that was the movie.
Yeah, I mean,
Ah,
yeah.
my heart's moved, 'cause it is one of the finest, and it's written, yeah, Phil was a preacher, and if you don't like that, well, maybe Ben Franklin will carry you along, but it is magnificent, and it echoes what you just said about this incredible preacher whose voice could go seemingly forever, but the interplay between Whitefield and Franklin is just something to behold. And
Yeah, they become fast friends. I mean,
it's,
Franklin remains, as far as we know, a skeptic his whole life,
Yeah.
but he considers Whitefield a brother.
yeah,
And
unfortunately, it's made the rounds. Tried to see it at Cortland Theater, and they said they bid on it. I don't know the process, but Ithaca finally got it, and you know, if Ithaca can get it, well, you know. Anyway, I encourage that, you know, it'll be out somehow, somewhere.
Whitefield was trained to be an actor, and so he was he was trained to.
but all the British actors
We're jealous.
were jealous of him. The Shakespearean actors. I mean, imagine speaking to 30,000 people. That's like Yankee Stadium. That's like the Dome. And in a field, you know, and being heard. And he does this, and it's not like he does it only once. As I said, he preaches 4 sermons a day. And these sermons are like hour-long sermons. Can you imagine what it does? I mean, you know, can you imagine being a commercial singer and singing that many times? And he's projecting without microphones, and it's extraordinary. And you know, he preaches his last sermon, and he dies that night, and his body is buried under the pulpit where he preached his last sermon in Northfield, Mass.
Yes.
I just wanted to say, hearing the history from the 1600s up until we became independent, and the fact that there were different denominations that came from Europe, is very easy to see that it was between right and wrong. To me, that's what it looks like. And even though these people might have had some, you know, they might not have agreed on every point, they knew what was right. And they were trying to pull the whole country together to do the right thing. That being attached to England was not the right thing because of the way they persecuted us, really. So I think it's very interesting that to know what we came to in 1776, we really need to know what happened in the 1600s.
I knew somebody who was a history major from Princeton, and even though we're both good Cornell people, the guy was at Cornell at that point, so I let him get away with it. He argued, and this is the first time I was a student at the time, what he always said is to understand, that's why we talked about 150 years in the making. In his case, what he said is, to understand what happens in an hour at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, you have to understand 400 years of Japanese history to understand 1 hour. This is the thing we never talked about. And again, when we started doing this 31 years ago, we talked the Declaration, and it just keeps going farther and farther and farther back. But it's also what you said about right and wrong. What, in their better moments, the Patriots are basing and saying, look, and there's one moment at Philbrook that doesn't come to mind, where he talks about the fact that the argument, what they're contesting is the fact that the British aren't even following British law. And they're saying, what you're doing is you're going against your own code. You're going against your own laws. We're still British citizens. You can't do this to us. That's what they're saying. You're doing this. We're one of you. It's sort of like a kid getting up and saying to their parents, you're playing favorites. You're not doing this to the people back in England. You're doing this to us. What gives? And you said that there is a right and wrong. The hard thing, though, is there's a right and wrong and there's not. And the more you study this, the more you see there is a black and white, ultimately the extremes, but the gray area is so huge in between. And this is what these, again, this is what, it's a mess. There's no other term. It's a mess. It ends well, but it's a mess. And this is why they're debating literally right up until the final vote. Anything else? Questions, thoughts? Jamie?
Yeah, I just want to have a question related to your comment about where, most of the battles were fought. I grew up down in the Newburgh area on the Hudson, and of course it's just filled with so much there about the history that we learned that early on. Washington's headquarters, the cantonment where Washington's troops were, and many of them died during the harsh winters, Fort Knox, etc. So, were there many battles in this region, or were they mostly along the Hudson in that area?
They were mostly along the Hudson and then up into Saratoga,
Okay.
in that area. I mean, this is wilderness at that point.
Yeah, that's
But that's why these rides are so extraordinary. I mean, you've got, as Chip said, Caesar Rodney is riding on roads, but he goes through 3 horses in 80 miles, and he covers it overnight. And you've got Revere, who's making these extraordinary rides, 200 miles. And it's wilderness. I mean, there's not 81s, and there aren't even paths, or they're barely paths. And so, yeah, so most of the battles are fought in that area, and that into New Jersey too, because it's much more settled, in fact, and even in South Carolina.
And I misspoke. It's not Fort Knox.
That's okay.
There's a headquarters.
Yeah.
Knox's headquarters is there.
By the way, a good book, if you've never read it, is David McCullough's 1776, and he talks about Knox. Henry Knox is a bookseller in Boston, and he goes and hauls these cannons, and they keep going.
They go in through the ice.
Yeah, and then he has to figure out how to get them out of, out of water.
They go. Yeah.
And as I said, he's a bookseller. He doesn't know anything about engineering and all those sorts of things, but they figure it out. I mean, necessity truly is the mother of invention. Anyway, we've kept you way too long.
Thanks so much.
And there are cookies.
Yeah, thanks very much. We really appreciate all that you've done here for us. And yes, please stay, tour the museum, have some refreshments, and pick Chip and Bud's brain even more.
And come to July 4th, 10 a.m.
And read, because reading the words is powerful.
Yeah, 10 a.m. July 4th, Center for the Arts. It's air conditioned finally. I mean, we didn't have that for 25 years, and it's a huge difference.
Thank you, Louie.
Thank you.